In this series, we've gone over how the Bible handles justice in lawsuit cases involving slaves, and some of the circumstances surrounding those case examples involve the beating of slaves. We didn't focus on the beating aspect specifically so far. We only just focused on compensation for grievances and how they're to be distributed in those cases. But now in this episode, I want to shift our focus from just compensation rather to the topic of beatings specifically found in the Bible and how we should view them in principle. There are several verses over this issue, but to address it just in general in this episode, let's center our attention around the verse in Exodus 21. Verses 20 through 21 say, "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money." And then verses 26 through 27 say, "When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free for the eye's sake. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go for the tooth's sake." Now, it may be very well tempting for modern Christians to dismiss this verse, as they do many others, by saying that it wasn't an endorsement of beatings, only that it was addressing cases where beatings happened to occur. Now, if you've been watching my series, you'll know that I find this to be a dishonest reading and a refusal to face up with what the text actually says. All sides can agree that the fact that this law is issuing punishment for severe beatings, the kind of which that risk death or permanent injury to the slave, is proof enough that the law outlaws abusive corporeal punishment. But based on the wording of these verses, the law actually does not prohibit at all beatings in principle. It states that some kind of beating is allowed so long as it does not lead to death or any kind of permanent injury. And this allowance spoken of is based on the part of the verse which states that the master is not to be punished in verse 21. But I'll go more into that later. So if the listener is confused about what that might mean, I would suggest that the listener begin purging from their mind any preconceived notions they may have associated with the term beatings, because these two verses are more than enough to demonstrate that the Bible sees the concept of beatings as being nothing more than corporeal punishment or corporeal discipline. These verses have gotten so much disparagement from hostile readers because they end up projecting onto the text imaginative ideas about what they believe a beating might entail, instead of letting the Bible dictate to them what beating actually means in its allowances. One way to help the listener understand this is by showing an aspect of beatings that the Bible endorses in a righteous implementation of it that falls into the category of corporeal discipline in family life. Let's look at these verses from Proverbs that speak of disciplinary beatings. Chapter 13, verse 24 says, "He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." Chapter 22, 15 says, "Folly is found up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." Chapter 23, verse 13 and 14, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you beat him with a rod, he will not die. If you beat him with a rod, you will save his life from Sheol." In chapter 29, verse 15, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left undisciplined brings shame to his mother." And then chapter 29, verse 17, "Discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give you delight to your heart." Now, these verses from Proverbs are more than enough to establish the biblical basis behind corporeal punishment of one's children in order to instill discipline. Now, nobody with two brain cells would ever conclude that these verses are teaching to hate or abuse your own child. The Bible is clear that tough love is still a form of love as well. And there's no ill will or intent to injure or abuse your own beloved child when implementing this form of discipline. And just in passing, when Exodus 21 refers to the use of the rod on the slave, it would be wrongful to understand that passage as if it's saying the rod was used to abusively oppress the slave, because Proverbs mentions that exact same rod being used on one's own beloved child in order to raise them up in discipline and understanding. And we don't commonly refer to these practices as beatings in the modern day, but more often we talk about them in terms of spankings. I know there's a movement in the modern West to advocate against the use of spankings on their children, but I'm one who's ardently against such a movement, and I believe that movement is actually causing more damage to society as a whole, not less. And if you are a Christian, I can't understand how you could possibly stand against spankings in principle with the presence of all these Bible verses speaking of its wisdom for discipline. I can understand the desire to avoid the abusiveness that can be associated with parents who do not utilize spankings in a prudent or righteous manner, but I'd like to share some personal wisdom I myself have learned from my father when it comes to recognizing where the line is between tough love and abuse with regard to spankings. Now, my dad always said that when I needed to be spanked as a punishment for my behavior, he told me that when it came time for him to spank me, if he ever felt angry in that moment, he stopped himself and walked away. And I think that's very wise to recognize in yourself, if you are implementing physical discipline out of anger, that it opens the door to abuse. You should only exercise physical discipline in a sober state of mind so that you can better attain the justified discipline that the Bible teaches. Now, some may say this is too dangerous of a practice to exercise because of how it might risk abuse. But you could say the same thing about so many other aspects of life. Fire is extremely dangerous and risky. But when used and handled properly, it actually makes our lives better. I would argue that corporeal punishment is the same way. And while it certainly must be handled carefully so as not to lead to damage, it's actually more damaging to not use it at all. Let's look at another verse addressing beatings when it comes to punishment for criminals. As I read this verse, notice how when it talks about beatings, even if they are justified, that they should not exceed an excessive threshold. This is Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. If there is a dispute between men, and they come into court, and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given him, but no more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. See how even the criminal is afforded protections from abusive beatings, if for no other reason than the fact that he also bears the image of God. And no man is to be treated in such a way where that image is tainted in the sight of other men. That law articulates that while it is necessary to discipline men, it is never allowed to treat men like animals or objects. And these same principles, if they can be fairly applied to children or criminals, why is it at all of a sudden considered unjust or shocking if they're applied to slaves as well? It's not unjust. It's altogether fair and right in cases where an obligated contractual slave is violating his responsibilities, purposefully malingering, taking advantage of his master, or any other activities that mere words are not solving by themselves. But there are going to be those who raise protests over this still, for no other reason than that they carry emotional baggage of America's abusive past when it comes to slavery. And these hostile readers will twist scriptures as much as they can in order to make it appear as if they are morally superior to the Bible, when in actuality they don't even believe their own BS. Here's a clip of Matt Dillahunty, who has created his entire fame and his own platform from doing this very thing. Here he is addressing a caller who began challenging him over this very topic of beatings in the Bible.
Let me just break this down to facts, because I'm still, maybe I'm slightly behind, but you have this scenario where one person owns another person. He then punishes that person for whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but in this case, I should say, that person is punished in the sense that the tormentor breaks every one of their bones, cuts them, basically flays them, does all of these horrific, nasty things. According to the edict, to the rules that was just read by Matt, God, the creator of the universe, moral authority, would not punish the person for doing that if that person survived.
And there's one addendum I have to put in. I'm sorry to stomp on this, because it also says in the same passage that based on what harm you do, like if you poke out a slave's eye, you have to let them go. So it's no longer an eye for an eye when it comes to slaves. If you poke out their eye, you have to let them go. But there's still no punishment for poking out their eye.
So in the scenario that I gave, the eyes are intact. You just happen to flay and break all the bones. That's okay. No punishment.
It doesn't get into all the punishments. It's not that they're not punishment. They're not going to be put to death.
It says there will be no punishment.
If someone beats a slave,
it literally says there will be no punishment.
Should a person be punished, whether or not the person is an employee, whether the person is in voluntary servitude, whether they've abducted and enslaved the person, regardless of the situation, should somebody be punished if they mercilessly beat another person with a rod?
Not even mercilessly, just punch him in the face. I mean, I just read the verse to you.
Also,
if I beat my slave and the slave does not die within a couple of days, no punishment shall come to me.
Okay, which is it, 1 or 2 days? Which one? Let's say
it says a day or two.
Here's
why does it matter whether it's 24 hours or 36 hours?
Or 5 minutes.
If it's okay for me to fucking beat someone as long as they don't die and I'm not to be punished, then basically slaves are on another tier, and it lists them as property.
Yes.
And you're trying to make excuses for this because you're unwilling to admit that there's something that the Bible advocates, which it should not. Why are you okay with owning people as property?
Is it ever moral to consider a human being as somebody else's property?
Military members aren't property. I was in the military for 8.5 years. We're not property.
Not property?
And even if you're property, you can't.
Property.
No, first of all, it was voluntary service, and you have to obey certain rules, but I'm not property, just like children aren't property. Parents are stewards of the children. I still had rights while I was in the military, and I still had avenues to do things. And if a superior officer had...
Yeah, you do. What about
if a superior officer had beaten me, it doesn't matter whether I died ever, they would have been punished.
Yeah.
You're comparing apples and oranges. This is the tap dance that people do when they are so infused in a religious belief that they will not acknowledge the simple fact, the simple obvious thing, that they have accepted something that is immoral. And so they want to do a bunch of hand waving. Well, you know, if you're in the military, you're property. No, you're not. Every one of your analogies is going to fail.
What about when you're in prison?
If you're in prison and a guard beats you, and whether you die or not, the guard can get punished.
I didn't ask whether... I'm talking about being property.
You're not property. You are a ward of the state. The state has an obligation to take care of you, and prisoners still have certain rights.
So you're not property.
But what you're engaged in is still whataboutism. Instead of pointing to the other things that you might think are objectionable, explain why you're not objecting to the thing that is explicitly objectionable in your book.
You have a right to do whatever you want over your own property. And so if people are property, then you can do whatever you want to them.
Notice how Alex O'Connor defined property at the end of that clip there. He said, if people are property, that means you can do whatever you want to them. Therefore, it's wrong to regard people as property because you cannot just do anything you want to people. Well, if that's your definition of property, fine. But it's not the Bible's definition. So Alex and Matt Dillahunty make a huge fuss over this term property as the Bible uses it, but the whole time they are infusing their own definition into it and projecting it onto the Bible. Matt and Alex may believe you can do whatever you want with your own property, but the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't even allow you to glean your fields the way you want to, and that certainly is your property. When the Bible refers to slaves as property, that does not mean you can do whatever you want to them. And the real tap dancing is when these hostile atheists ignore that blatant fact. Matt Dillahunty claimed that prisoners and military service members cannot be considered as property because, well, prisoners and military service members still have rights. But if you've been watching this series, I've labored over and over again that slaves in the Bible also had rights. So what is Matt Dillahunty going on about? Can Matt demonstrate at all how military service members are at all any different than biblical slaves? because he can't seem to articulate at all how they are different in terms of being referenced as property. So what else does he have? Well, the caller of the show brought up how military service members in the modern day are physically disciplined. And the caller brought this up in an attempt to show how the concept of beatings in the Bible isn't as sinister as Matt was trying to make it out to be. But Matt was very quick to retort that he himself served 8 years in the military and never received a beating from a superior officer once. And that if he ever did, that officer would be punished. Now, Matt Dillahunty may feel like that's all he needs to say to dismiss this idea that military service is a modern form of biblical slavery, but Matt would be wrong in that. On every point that I can see, the lessons we've learned about biblical slavery so far in this series are all implemented and made manifest in the modern day practices of Western militaries in general and the United States military in specific. When a new recruit wants to join the Army, for example, and he voluntarily signs a contract for a financial bonus, he is effectively taking that financial bonus as a loan in exchange for his physical labor to the state for a set amount of years. During the life of that contract, he's to work off that debt by living and performing duties that the government tells him to do while living on the wages and provisions that they provide him, even if that work has to be hard and dangerous labor that could put him in a war zone. And this is all done with all kinds of stipulations placed over him until he fulfills his contract. This sounds almost exactly like all the conditions we've already covered so far about how slaves were to be treated in the Bible, which makes it a lot easier to see in real time how the realities of biblical slavery are not as unjust or sinister as Matt tries to vilify them to be, considering the modern military operates the same way. But what about the issue of beatings? Is Matt correct in saying that this is the main difference between slaves of the Bible and modern soldiers? That soldiers are not beaten, and if they ever were, it would be considered illegal? With all due respect to Matt Dillahunty and his service of 8 years he gave to the Navy, I have a very high suspicion that his job and specialty while in the Navy was something more akin to an administrative role rather than a combat role. Now, that's not me dogging on administrative positions. They are absolutely vital in the military, but they're not the types of roles that expose you to the realities of why the military exists in the first place, and the necessary forms of discipline instilled on soldiers in order to accomplish the tasks they have to carry out. While administrative roles are important, the military does not exist for administrators to do their job. It exists to enact violent, combative soldiers. Combat roles do not exist to support administrators. Rather, administrators exist to support combat roles. It makes sense why Matt believes the military does not engage in the practice of corporeal punishment for its own service members, because Matt was never in a specialty where such discipline was necessary to be experienced. But there very well are many combat role specialties in the military that do experience this, and they are primarily centered on service members who have the highest likelihood of experiencing the most stressful forms of combat, such as, for example, the special operations community. Now, I may be wrong on this, but I don't think Matt was a Navy SEAL during his time in the Navy, because if he had been, I have a hard time believing he'd be so quick to say that beatings are not part of the military experience. Let me just show you a few clips of interviews where former operators describe their training experience in special operations and how it included being beaten as a training mechanism to instill levels of discipline needed to accomplish their operations. Throughout these clips, you'll hear terms such as SUT or the Q course or SEER, which are just names of different phases of training that special forces go through as they experience these high levels of physical discipline.
After that, you go to SEER school, get your ass kicked. So that was 3 weeks long. I believe it was 3 weeks. 3 weeks long. 3 weeks of SEER school, which is an excellent school, and they are allowed to hit you. I never been smacked by a woman so hard in my life. For laughing, I smiled, and she just kicked the living crap out of me. She saw me laughing. She come the hell out of there and just smacked the living daylights out of me, man. But anyway, they will smack the shit out of you. They will give you a black eye, and it ain't no joke. So that's like 3 days of ass beatings. They got light cells and hard cells, and you have to pass these. Some guys break down. I've seen guys break down and they went loopy. And the guy had to stop the training, pull out his card and say, I'm Staff Sergeant so-and-so, you're in the United States Army and you're here. Do you know who I am?
Oh, shit.
Yeah, it'll get to some dudes.
One of the drills was they put a hood over your head. They give you a rifle or a pistol. You don't know if it's loaded. You don't know if it's unloaded. You don't know if it's jammed. You just have this. If they put a hood on your head, then they give you a weapon, and you don't know what condition the weapon's in. And then there's all these role player. It's simunition rounds, which is basically kind of like high-speed paintball. And so they have all these role players in there. And you lift the hood up, and it might be a bunch of dudes that look bad that are coming at you, but they're not really coming at you. And a lot of guys will get amped up and they'll shoot. Mm-hmm. You're done. Get out. You can't handle it. And then but you'll run through 3 to 5 iterations. One time I had the hood pulled up. The hood didn't even come all the way up and just get punched in the face, right off the bat.
And this 6'6" black man that was probably 230, 40 pounds, he's a large man, slaps me with an open hand that might as well have been a closed hand. And it rocked me. It rocked me. And I remember going, I underestimated that. That slap really hurt. And then he goes, you want to give me the information now? But not enough to break me. I said, no, sir. I'm not going to give you that information. And he slaps me again in the same exact spot. Here's something else as a man. You probably know this as well. You ever been slapped in the same spot twice in your face? Probably not. It's a weird thing to ever have happened to you. Maybe you've had an abusive girlfriend. That's a story for another time. I have not. The first one hurt. The second one felt worse than the first one. And by the time he hit me the third and the fourth time in my face, I said, where do you want me to sign? I've underestimated this whole experience. Where do you want me to sign? And I sure yourself signed. And there are other times where guys will think that, hey, you can't break me with slapping. They're creative. They'll find a way to break you. But more importantly, what Sear was really, really good about, Sear was amazing. Sear really, you want to find out what you're made of, what you're really made of, go to Sear. You think you'll never break? I got slapped a couple times and I signed a paper. You think you'll never break? It's just slaps. Have your friend get slapped 30 times in front of you and start bleeding from the mouth and be like, well, maybe not. You don't think you'll break? Have them wheel out an American flag in front of you. Tell them to burn your own American flag. And if not, they're going to take your best friend in 30-degree weather, and they're just going to keep spraying him with cold water while he's shaking so hard it looks like he's about to pull a muscle. And you can make it all stop by just burning your flag. I mean, you're talking about some serious mind games. They'll break you. And all for the best reasons.
I want you to really pay attention to this next clip because this former Delta Force operator is going to talk about the benefits he saw firsthand from his experiences in the training phases of his Special Forces career.
But SEER school was legit. I really loved it. It really showed you who you were as a person and was really eye-opening into some of the horrors of war and some of the decisions you may have to make. And I think part of that training and part of that, I'm not saying special operations guys don't have PTSD, but such a powerful tool in preventing PTSD is telling you, hey, something bad may happen to you. And you might want to go ahead and deal with it now. Because if you don't want to deal with the fact that you live you have a dangerous job and that bad things are going to happen, when those bad things happen, it kind of breaks the mold of your mind. It makes your mind go, I never imagined I'd ever see this. And it does. It breaks your mind. Through the Q course and through SEER, through the Q course, the whole time when you're, in SUT and you're carrying a fake casualty of your teammate and trying to run to a helicopter that's actually sitting right there, and instructor's yelling at you, get him to the helicopter, get him to the helicopter. You don't get him to the helicopter, he's going to die. Get him in a helicopter. And then, of course, it's training, so the helicopter takes off. Even though you made it there in time magically got faster. Helicopter takes off right in front of you, and your instructor says you were too slow. Now he's dead, and you're going to carry him all the way back to base. And this is what happens when you don't meet the standard combat. People die. And let me tell you, when I carried Chris Robinson's body to a helicopter, it didn't break my mind. I didn't go, I never thought I'd carry a friend's dead body. I thought, this is exactly what they told me was going to happen. Yeah. This is what I thought it'd feel like. It's what they told me was going to happen. So going through that type of training is important to not just toughen the body and to learn experience, but to toughen the mind as well, to be prepared. Again, little did what we know was about to be the most extensive period of combat America's ever seen.
It didn't break my mind. Did you hear him say that? The same wisdom that Proverbs talked about is spoken of right here in this clip by this operator, that forging his body through the crucible of physical discipline not only protected his mind from psychological problems such as PTSD, but it also prepared his mind to handle incredibly intense conflicts. The U.S. military is fully aware of the fruits that this kind of discipline brings. And while people like Matt Dillahunty decry such measures of corporeal discipline as being draconian remnants that should be left to the past of an immoral people, the modern U.S. military refuses to abandon this practice altogether because of just how fruitful it has been in bringing the benefits of superior operators on the front lines of their geopolitical agendas. The U.S. government keeps this practice around because they see and recognize the wisdom of it. The same wisdom that the Bible had already been teaching on thousands of years beforehand. Now, I'm not saying that corporeal discipline of the same intensity or magnitude that special forces go through should be implemented on everyone else in equal magnitude. No. But lesser or proportionate measures of it can be practiced depending on specific circumstances in order to yield the same kinds of fruits we've already seen mentioned. When it comes to raising children, I absolutely believe that spankings are a form that forges the mind of a child to withstand psychological hang-ups and prevents their minds from ever being broken by life when they're facing moral quandaries. If you ever did a survey of the younger generations in the modern day that never experienced corporeal punishments from their own parents, I think you won't have to look very far at all to see a lot of broken minds. And that's not a coincidence. But bringing it back to the topic of slavery and how Matt Dillahunty decried the practice of beating slaves, his entire critique was based on a melodramatic interpretation of Exodus 21, verse 20 through 21, when the verse says, "But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished." And Matt gets carried away by unjustifiably saying that this verse teaches that you can beat your slaves within an inch of their life. One of his co-hosts, who runs a channel called Rationality Rules, said that it also means you can break all your slaves' bones so long as they didn't die. What? This guy is completely disconnected from reality if he thinks breaking every bone isn't going to lead to death. But beyond that, such permanent injury that may not be lethal has already been shown to be forbidden by the Bible. So his interpretation is infused with all manner of dishonest nonsense, which I hope my listener can see is in direct contradiction of everything the Bible has said, and that I pointed out already from previous videos. So much for rationality ruling. So besides the fact that they are blatantly, yes, lying about what the Bible teaches concerning this topic, I have to ask, do they even believe what they claim? Do they really believe the Bible is teaching this form of abuse that they say is being taught in Exodus 21? When Matt Dillahunty says that Exodus 21 teaches a master can just go open season on his own slaves and beat them with impunity within an inch of their life, so long as they don't die, does Matt actually believe that's an honest reading of what the Bible is endorsing? I'll tell you right now, he doesn't actually believe that. He's actually lying about what he himself actually believes the Bible to be honestly teaching, because as soon as he lets his guard down with another caller who already agrees with him, he begins to reveal that he doesn't actually have any objection to the type of slavery taught in Exodus 21.
But the odd thing to me is that having been slaves themselves,
Yeah.
you would think they would be more opposed to slavery.
Slavery isn't the equivalent of perpetual torture. It's a matter, even in the South, and you watch whatever else, and yes, we're talking about beating people. That's why my huge objection is this idea of owning them as property. It's absolutely stupid of a slave owner to continually beat and torture his slaves, because guess what? They're not going to be very productive. You're going to have injured people rather than actual workers. So by and large, slavery can be beneficial to the slaves as well. I mean, it's not. I'm not trying to play this up as a plus, but you're in a situation where you have regular work and food and everything else, and you're taken care of, and you're part of the system, and you're being productive. The problem here is not that everything about everything that happens within this is necessarily evil. It's that you are not free. You are owned. Your decisions are not your own. You are property.
Wow. Let me play that again so you don't miss it.
By and large, slavery can be beneficial to the slaves as well. Beneficial to the slaves as well. Beneficial to the slaves as well. But you're in a situation where you have regular work and food and everything else, and you're taken care of, and you're part of the system, and you're being productive. The problem here is not that everything about everything that happens within this is necessarily evil. Is not that everything about everything that happens within this is necessarily evil.
So Matt Dillahunty reveals that slavery actually wasn't evil and could even be beneficial for the slave. How about that? So if Matt Dillahunty thinks the beatings spoken of in Exodus 21 were never actually intended to be abusive or injurious, since that isn't good for anyone involved, then what is Matt's actual objection? If it was pointed out to him that modern military practices even invoke the practice of corporeal discipline, what grounds would he have left to object to the beatings spoken of in the Bible and in Exodus 21 specifically? None. He would have no grounds left at all to stand on in his objections, not only to corporeal discipline specifically, but to biblical slavery in general. You heard him say yourself that slavery actually wasn't all bad, and it benefited the slave. So despite what you hear him saying when he's arguing with Christians on his broadcasts, you can know that Matt Dillahunty is not knowledgeable about the type of training special operations undergo, but he is knowledgeable about the fact that biblical slavery is not as evil as he portrays it to be, as you just heard him say. Which reveals that Matt Dillahunty is more concerned with speaking out of both sides of his mouth and engaging in duplicitous hypocrisy than he is with dealing honestly with Christians about what the Bible says.